Good evening, Coral Springs. I am your Vice Mayor, Nancy Metayer Bowen, but before I begin my remarks, I would like to acknowledge my parents who are in the audience this evening, Miss Lynn and Marley Metayer. I am the leader that I am today because they instilled some amazing core values to me and my brothers and sister. So thank you, Mommy and Daddy. Love you.
In a quiet residential neighborhood of Coral Springs, the life of Vice Mayor Nancy Metayer Bowen came to a sudden and violent end, an outcome that would later unfold in courtrooms and investigative files with disturbing clarity. Authorities would ultimately focus on one central figure, her husband, Stephen Bowen. What initially appeared to be a welfare check quickly evolved into a complex homicide investigation involving forensic reconstruction, conflicting timelines, and concealed evidence. As prosecutors pieced together the case, small inconsistencies, overlooked in the early hours, became critical turning points. The final outcome would hinge not on a single revelation, but on a chain of details, digital traces, physical evidence, and statements that did not align. This is a case where conclusion came first, and only by retracing each step backward did investigators uncover what truly happened inside that home. Every case starts with evidence and works toward the truth. We rely on verified facts, documented timelines, and official records, not speculation or sensationalism. Subscribe to stay updated as we examine each case clearly, carefully, and professionally.
I'm not going to keep you all too long. Hi, everyone. Vice Mayor Nancy Metayer Bowen. I would love to share with you all that I am so grateful that you all came here tonight to really express your concerns and how to make our schools better. I can tell you what myself and what my commission do not want. We do not want any of our schools shut down. That is number one.
The case surrounding Nancy Metayer Bowen concluded with a focused prosecutorial outcome centered on her husband, Stephen Bowen. He was formally charged with premeditated murder and evidence tampering, establishing the legal position that the act was deliberate rather than impulsive. Authorities classified the incident as domestic violence with no additional suspects, narrowing the investigative scope entirely to the marital relationship. This classification was not immediate, but developed after the review of physical evidence, witness statements, and behavioral patterns observed after the incident. The prosecution structured its case around three primary pillars: intent, concealment, and post-crime conduct. Rather than arguing a spontaneous escalation, investigators presented a sequence indicating preparation, execution, and attempted cover-up. Each stage was supported by physical findings and documented inconsistencies. By the time charges were filed, the case had transitioned from uncertainty to a defined narrative supported by forensic analysis, digital records, and corroborated testimony. The outcome reflected a reconstruction of events built systematically from evidence rather than assumption. The evidentiary foundation of the case relied on multiple independent elements that, when combined, formed a consistent sequence of events. Investigators recovered spent shotgun shells within the residence, establishing the use of a firearm inside the home. Examination of surrounding materials revealed signs consistent with a makeshift sound suppression attempt, including a burned pillow that showed damage patterns aligned with discharge proximity. This indicated not only the method used, but also an effort to reduce detection. The victim was located wrapped in blankets and garbage bags, positioned in a manner suggesting deliberate concealment rather than immediate discovery. This action indicated post-incident handling of the body and aligned with an attempt to delay external awareness. The use of readily available household materials suggested the perpetrator acted within a familiar environment. A critical component of the case involved statements attributed to the suspect, in which he allegedly admitted to shooting his wife multiple times. These statements were reported by a family member and later provided to law enforcement. The wording of the admission, including references to personal strain, contributed to establishing both involvement and context. Evidence showed that the suspect attempted to transfer possession of the weapon and ammunition after the incident. This action demonstrated awareness of the weapon's evidentiary value and indicated an effort to distance himself from the instrument used in the crime. Investigators identified text messages sent from within the residence after the estimated time of death. These messages presented a narrative that the victim was unavailable or elsewhere. When compared with physical evidence and timeline reconstruction, these communications were determined to be inconsistent with actual events, reinforcing conclusion of intentional misdirection. Each category of evidence functioned independently, but also reinforced the others. The convergence of ballistic findings, concealment actions, admissions, and digital inconsistencies created a cohesive evidentiary structure. The investigation experienced a decisive shift when two key developments occurred simultaneously. First, a family member reported a direct confession from the suspect to law enforcement. This report introduced a first-hand account that directly implicated him and provided investigators with new direction. Second, authorities were able to track the suspect's movements and recover the weapon believed to have been used in the incident. This recovery connected physical evidence to the suspect and allowed for further forensic examination. Prior to this point, the case had not yet reached a definitive classification as homicide. However, the combination of a reported confession and tangible evidence established a direct link between the suspect and the act. This moment effectively transformed the case from a missing person or welfare inquiry into a confirmed homicide investigation with a primary suspect. Alternative explanations, including voluntary absence or external involvement, became inconsistent with the available data. From this stage forward, investigative efforts focus on validating and reinforcing the emerging narrative through forensic testing, digital analysis, and corroboration of witness statements. At the initial stage, the case did not present as a confirmed homicide. Instead, several early interpretations shaped the initial response. Initial assumption: welfare concerned the first response was triggered by miscommunications and scheduled obligations. Officials and colleagues believed the victim was unreachable or delayed, prompting a welfare check rather than an immediate criminal investigation. Possible disappearance scenario text messages sent from the residence suggested that the victim might be temporarily unavailable. These communications introduced the possibility that she had left voluntarily or was otherwise occupied. At this stage, there was no immediate evidence contradicting these claims. Absence of forced entry. Initial observations indicated no signs of forced entry into the residence. This detail did not immediately trigger suspicion, but later became significant. At the time, it contributed to perception that no external threat was present. These early interpretations influenced the pace and direction of the investigation. The absence of visible external indicators allowed time to pass before the situation was recognized as a homicide. As a result, critical hours elapsed, during which evidence may have been altered, removed, or repositioned. These delays required investigators to later reconstruct the timeline with greater reliance on forensic and digital data. The primary location of the incident was a private residence in Coral Springs. The controlled nature of the environment played a significant role in both the commission of the act and the subsequent investigation. Body location and condition: the victim was found in an upstairs bedroom, concealed under layers of household materials. The positioning indicated that the body had been moved or arranged after the incident. The concealment was not sophisticated, but was sufficient to delay immediate detection during a limited visual inspection. Projectile evidence investigators identified damage consistent with firearm discharge inside the home, including trajectory indicators and material impact points. These findings confirmed that the shooting occurred within the residence rather than at an external location. Use of household materials: items used in concealment, blankets, bags, and other materials, were sourced within the home. This detail reinforced the conclusion that the perpetrator had full access and familiarity with the environment. There were no indications of forced entry, struggle involving multiple unknown individuals, or external intrusion. Scene control: the overall condition of the scene suggested that the individual responsible had the opportunity to remain in the residence after the incident, manage the environment, and attempt partial concealment. Taken together, these elements indicated that the perpetrator was not an outsider, but someone with unrestricted access, time, and knowledge of the household layout. The final confirmed activities of Nancy Metayer Bowen were structured, documented, and consistent with her public responsibilities. On the morning she was later reported missing, she had ongoing communication related to scheduled meetings and official duties tied to her role in Coral Springs governance. These communications included confirmations, routine acknowledgments, and forward-looking coordination, indicating no immediate disruption in her professional schedule. From an investigative standpoint, These interactions established a fixed point in time, a verifiable moment when she was presumed active and functioning within her expected routine. This point became essential in narrowing the timeline. Investigators used digital records, such as timestamps, message delivery confirmations, and recipient responses to validate that these communications were legitimate and not fabricated after the fact. The reconstruction of events placed the alleged time of death on the night prior to her scheduled commitments. This conclusion was not immediate, but was derived through a combination of forensic indicators, including body condition, environmental factors within the residence, and inconsistencies between physical findings and reported activity. The following morning marked the first observable deviation from her routine. Colleagues who expected her presence at official engagements noted her absence. Initially, this absence did not trigger alarm beyond standard concern, as public officials occasionally encounter scheduling conflicts. However, as time progressed without any direct communication from her, concern escalated from routine to procedural. A welfare check was initiated. This decision marked a critical transition in the case, from assumption of delay to suspicion of an underlying issue. Law enforcement response to the residence introduced the first external verification of her status. The period between her last confirmed communication and the welfare check became a critical forensic window. During this interval, investigators later determined that key events occurred, including the alleged homicide and subsequent actions taken within the residence. The absence of external witnesses during this time frame meant that the reconstruction relied heavily on indirect evidence, digital footprints, physical traces, and behavioral analysis. This gap also allowed for potential manipulation perception, particularly through continued communication originating from within the home. Messages sent during this period were initially interpreted as legitimate, but were later reevaluated in the context of the full investigation. These communications contributed to a temporary delay in recognizing the severity of the situation. In forensic analysis, such gaps are often pivotal. They represent periods where actions are unobserved but leave traceable consequences. In this case, the window between last contact and discovery became the foundation upon which the timeline was reconstructed, influencing both investigative direction and prosecutorial argument. Nancy Metayer Bowen held a position that combined public visibility with administrative responsibility. As vice mayor of Coral Springs, she operated within a structured political environment that required consistent engagement with both government processes and community initiatives. Her role carried historical significance. She was the first Black and Haitian American woman to serve on the city's commission, a distinction that elevated her profile within both local and broader political networks. This position was not ceremonial. It involved active participation in policy discussions, municipal decision-making, and public representation. Professionally, her background extended beyond politics. She was trained as an environmental scientist and had been involved in initiatives focused on community resilience and environmental sustainability. Her work included collaboration with state-level programs, indicating an operational scope that reached beyond municipal boundaries. At the time of her death, there were indications that she was expanding her political trajectory. Increased visibility, broader engagement, and strategic positioning suggested preparation for higher office or greater influence within political structures. This phase of professional growth often involves heightened activity, increased public appearances, and expanded networks. From an investigative perspective, her background provided both context and contrast. On one hand, her public role required transparency, routine, and accountability. On the other hand, the incident that led to her death occurred within a private setting, outside the scope of her professional environment. This contrast became significant in understanding the case. Public figures often maintain structured external lives, but internal dynamics, particularly within personal relationships, operate independently of public oversight. Investigators had to separate her professional identity from her private circumstances to accurately assess motive, opportunity, and sequence of events. Her established routine also aided in identifying deviations. Because her schedule was typically organized and documented, any disruption became more noticeable. This consistency allowed colleagues to recognize her absence quickly, which in turn initiated a chain of events leading to discovery. One of the earliest overlooked elements involved communication patterns attributed to Stephen Bowen. Messages sent from the residents during the critical time frame appear consistent with normal activity. Recipients initially accepted these communications without question, as they aligned superficially with expected behavior. However, later analysis revealed inconsistencies. These included variations in tone, timing irregularities, and content that did not fully correspond with known schedules. At the initial stage, these discrepancies were not sufficient to trigger suspicion. Only after the timeline was reconstructed did these communications gain evidentiary significance. The interval between the first misengagement and the initiation of a welfare check created a temporal gap. During this period, no external verification of the victim's status occurred. This delay, although not excessive by standard procedural measures, provided an opportunity for actions within the residence to go unobserved. Investigators later considered how this gap may have allowed for evidence staging or alteration. The absence of immediate intervention meant that the scene, when eventually accessed, had already undergone changes that complicated initial interpretation. Another critical oversight involved a lack of immediate consideration of intimate partner involvement. Early assumptions did not prioritize the possibility of domestic violence. This is a common investigative pattern when there are no visible signs of forced entry or external intrusion. Because the environment was familiar and controlled, initial assessments did not immediately classify it as a high-risk domestic scenario. Only after evidence began to contradict external threat theories did investigators shift focus inward. This delay in recognizing the domestic context influenced the direction of early investigative efforts. Resources were initially oriented toward broader possibilities before narrowing to the immediate environment. Despite the accumulation of evidence and the establishment of a formal case, several questions remain unresolved or only partially addressed. One key issue involves a specific escalation of motive. While the outcome indicates intent, the precise sequence of interactions or conditions that led to the alleged act remains unclear. Determining whether the event was a result of sudden escalation or a prolonged buildup is critical for understanding the dynamics involved. Another question concerns prior indicators of conflict. Investigators examine available records or evidence of documented disputes, complaints, or interventions. The extent to which such indicators existed, and whether they were recognized or acted upon, remains a point of analysis. The role of mental health or personal stressors also requires consideration. Statements attributed to the suspect suggested internal strain, but the degree to which these factors influence behavior is not definitively established. Evaluating these elements involves reviewing medical, psychological, and situational data. A further consideration is the potential for earlier intervention. This includes both professional mechanisms, such as counseling or legal action, and informal support systems. Assessing whether any form of intervention could have altered the outcome is complex and often speculative, but remains relevant for broader preventive analysis. The case involving Metayer Bowen demonstrates how investigative clarity is often achieved only after a systematic reconstruction of events. The final outcome, when viewed in isolation, presents a structured narrative supported by evidence. However, this clarity is a result of revisiting earlier assumptions, correcting timelines, and reinterpreting details that initially appeared insignificant. By examining the sequence in reverse, it becomes evident that critical elements were present from the beginning but lacked context. Communications that seemed routine, delays that appeared procedural, and environments that felt secure all contributed to an initial interpretation that did not fully reflect the underlying reality. Only through detailed analysis, integrating forensic data, behavioral patterns, and chronological reconstruction, did these elements align to form a coherent account. This process underscores the importance of continuous reassessment in investigative work, particularly in cases where early indicators may be subtle or misleading. The case illustrates that outcomes are not defined solely by decisive moments, but by the accumulation and reinterpretation of details over time. Facts verified. Case concluded. Justice is determined by what can be proven. Subscribe for more documented cases and real criminal investigations.